And so let's get started with the webinar. Thank you guys for showing up today. I'm certainly glad to have made it on time I don't know why I scheduled the webinar on top of a tournament or vice versa. I think I scheduled the webinar first, but we are here, and we had a decent finish on South Holston. We finished 13th, got a check, had fun. A lot of smallmouth, some largemouth too. But the webinar that we're going to be discussing today, the topic is color selection. Okay, so we're going to talk about a lot of different ways to choose the right presentation, the right bait. And this webinar, like the others, is brought to you by Navionics. Navionics has been a great partner of mine for many years now. And so if you guys like this webinar, please look into Navionics for any of their products. At the very least, you got to check out their mobile app. And of course, the host is me, Miles Burghoff, aka Sonar. I'm a professional angler. I fish a lot of tournaments. I fish the Bassmaster Opens, a lot of BFLs around here. Just love tournament fishing. That's my main passion. But I also host a fishing show called Sweetwater. It's on NBC Sports, Sportsman's Channel, and also Sun Sports down in Florida. So there we go. I also guide on Chickamauga. So that's a little bit about myself. So let's get into it. So introduction. There's a lot of different things that we're gonna talk about. First, we're gonna talk about matching the hatch. I got one slide on that. Weather and lake conditions and how they affect your bait selections. Bait categories, and we're gonna dive into choosing colors with jigs, bottom bouncing soft plastics, skirted reaction baits, crankbaits, and topwaters. And there's other categories in there too. And I tried to pick the general categories. So if you guys have any specific baits you want to kind of discuss, throw it in there, man. I got all night. Now that I'm here for you guys. And then we're going to talk about keeping it simple, which is something that's very important for everything. And then regional colors. Okay, I've got one slide on that, just very short, simple. All right, so let's dive right into it. I figured that matching the hatch should probably be the very first slide on here. Now, essentially, that is the first thing that we learn as anglers is you know, how to match the hatch and why matching the hatch is so important. It's a crucial concept that is really important for selecting the correct lure color and color selection. And it essentially is trying to match your presentation, your bait, to the basic size, shape, and color of the predominant forage that the bass are feeding on, and not just the bass, the forage that is in a lake, but the forage that the bass that you're specifically trying to catch. You know, if you're fishing in the back of a creek, maybe it's crawfish and bluegill. If you're fishing the main lake, maybe it's shad or something like that. So you got to adjust your color choices and your presentation based on the specific bait fish that the bass that you're catching are eating, not just the rest of the lake and in general. And matching the hatch isn't always the same for any one species on different lakes. Okay, and, you know, you could have shad that are colored a certain way on one lake, but because of the tint of the watercolor on another lake, they're completely different. They've got the same basic counter shading, but they've got some different hues. Maybe they got a little bit of purple, a little bit of yellow, or whatever it is. And same thing goes for say bluegill or crawfish. Crawfish are really the best example, because crawfish, there's hundreds of different species of crawfish, and each one has a different color variation, and each one is you know, here in the South, that red crawfish that's in the bottom left-hand corner, that's a really good example of what you find in the springtime this time of year. So we've already got some people on the Q&A. Dan, I feel you. Not quite like you're feeling up there in Ontario, but it was a very cold day on the water. Matt, will I touch up on dips and dyes or markers? I don't have a slide for that, but that's a really good subject. So I'm going to circle back to that and hit that at the end. Let's do a little bit of talking about dyes and markers. That's going to be a really good subject. All right, so we got, yeah, Jonathan, we are definitely going to be talking about the tint in the water. That's going to be a slide all its own. All right, so let's keep on moving. Oh, there we go. That's actually the first slide. So let's talk about watercolor. So watercolor to me is one of the most important factors when it comes to choosing a bait. Okay, and not every lake is the same, obviously. When you go out on a lake down in Florida, you notice that it has a dark tannic stain to it. It may be clear water, but it still has that kind of coffee stain. It's the difference between, you know, having real watered down coffee, having that clear water, but still have it stained, and then having real dark, dirtier, kind of siltier water. But in the end, it's all tannic stained and very similar. So that's one case. And in the case of South Holston, for instance, very clear green water. Okay, so it had that very greenish water to it. So some of the shad that I was seeing, you know, I actually caught some shad. I snagged some shad just to kind of take a look at them, and they had this very greenish, very subtle greenish hue. And what happens with bait fish in particular, and this is really pertaining more to fish species, not crawfish quite as much as far as the watercolor. But when it comes to shad or herring or alewife or even, you know, sunfish species, animals, you know, bait fish species, just like everything else, have the ability to camouflage themselves to their surrounding environment. And that really pertains to, for schooling bait fish like shad, to the watercolor. So when you start seeing those greenish tints, that's when you want to start incorporating more greenish colors into your presentation. I know this isn't exactly on the slide here, because on the slide I just have the basic kind of template for how I choose color, the colors that I choose. But this is the reason behind that. So you know, those bait fish are going to camouflage themselves to that watercolor. If I'm in a situation where the water is a little bit more blue, obviously I'm going to start using some more blue hues, things of that sort. And conversely, in dirtier water, maybe it's brown or tannic stained, I'm still going to be using the same principle and kind of matching my bait to that surrounding area. And that's primarily for the bait fish, not the crawfish or anything on the bottom. Let's see what we got in the questions. Yeah, so we've got a question as far from Dave from Ontario, also a bloom color. So algae bloom color, it tends to be green. You know, you tend to see more green. It's a real heavy green, and that's the same principle. When I see that green color, that green tint in the water, you know, South Holston, I'm sure that the reason it's so green is partly because it has, you know, that algae, that phytoplankton in there, and that's creating that tint. But that's when I'm going to use a little bit more green. You know, usually what I do is I use a basic bait fish color, but that's when I start looking for the green flakes. So just a little subtle color additions. That's when I use flake to my advantage to create that real subtle color variation. Got another question from Rick. At the lake I fish in Southern California, what's up from Cali? I have stained water, but often have blue sky fishing. Is it more important to pick colors related to the water or the sky? All right, so I always say the water. So the water is very important. However, the conditions of the sky is also very important, but it's not going to really change the basic tones that you're going to be using. So if you have stained water, say it's got a little bit more, it's kind of a greenish brown. You're still going to want to use a greenish brown, but since it's sunny, maybe you want to use a little bit more chrome, some shine, something with a little bit more reflection on it. And we're going to be talking about that. So let's get to the slide here. Great questions, guys. So we're gonna get into more questions pretty soon here. So let's talk about the watercolor. My basic rule for clear water, the more you want to camouflage your bait, your presentation. Okay, so the clear water, camouflage it to if you're fishing baits on the surface or trying to imitate shad, kind of mid water column. That's when I'm going to want it to match the color of my bait to the color of the water. If I don't know exactly what the bait fish looks like, if I don't have an actual visual representation, a dead shad that's floating on the surface, or you can see a bluegill or whatever, I'm going to make my best guess by matching the color of my bait to the color of the water, the tint of the water. Okay. And in clear water, it's very important to not only match the color of your bait to the color of the water, but also use more translucent, transparent, and reflective colors, things that are either going to be very subtle. The fish have very good eyesight, so they're going to be able to see it. But they're really looking for those more. They're really going to get triggered by those more subtle colors, like you can see here in the bottom left-hand corner. This color right here, this is the diesel minnows from Z-Man. That color right there is called bad shad. That is one of the best colors if you've got a kind of greenish clear water kind of situation. Clear water, green tint. This is a really good color because it's got just the right touch of green, but it's also transparent. It looks very, very real from above, but the fish can absolutely see it, and they get. And the same goes for reflective colors. If it's a little bit more sunny, like we're going to be talking about on another slide, using reflective colors like this chrome crankbait down here in the bottom of the screen, that's a great way to trigger strikes from fish in clear water, because the fish aren't seeing exactly the shape of the presentation, the shape of the bait. They're just seeing that reflection, which, that shine looks like a bait fish that's trying to get away, and that's what's going to trigger the strike. So you want to kind of camouflage it, make it look less apparent, and use chromes or golds or something like that to kind of camouflage it, but also create a little bit of shine. The dirtier the water, the bolder and more solid colors you want to use. So essentially in dirtier water, you want to go ahead and create a profile, something that stands out. So you don't want to use those transparent colors. You want to use very, very bold colors. Okay, white, chartreuse. If it's tannic stain, maybe it's a black. Use reds, yellows, something that stands out very, very well in that dirty water and has a very good profile. Now in tannic stain water, like we said, it can still be clear, but use of dark colors like black and blue, Junebug, reds, golds, those are all strong choices, because they really, in tannic stain water, if you catch a bait fish, you tend to notice that they're much, much darker. Same principle as in clear water. They are camouflaging themselves and blending into their surroundings. So let's see what kind of questions we got now. And if I breeze over one of your questions, I'm going to get back to it later. And it may be not the, I may have a slide already. Here's a good question, and I'm not sure if I have the exact answer to it, because I think that there's a lot of different variables. Matt says there are plenty of variables, but how deep does water staining occur? For example, if it is dirty in spring, could it be dirty down to 40+ feet? My experience, now I don't know how deep in every situation the stain's going to be. However, and the only thing that I can really say is the general water stain. I think it's pretty consistent throughout, except for during the summer when you've got a thermocline, where you have that transition from the nutrient rich upper part of the water column down to the pretty much the very clear and void water column down on the bottom. But for most of the year, as far as just the watercolor itself, I think it stays pretty consistent. But if you've got a lot of wave action that's creating a mud line and kind of a layer of mud on the water, I don't think that really expands very deep in most situations. A lot of times you go into those kind of mud lines, and you can churn up the water with your trolling motor, and you can see the clear water underneath. So I think it only goes for a very thin distance there in most situations. So you can use a presentation that goes right below it, and they're going to see it very, very well, because it's clear water underneath. It's a really good pattern to fish, is wind-blown shorelines that have clay and that create that mud line. You can really pick up a lot of fish on a spinnerbait and things like that. Jonathan, you're asking about the bait name. I think you're referring to the diesel minnows from Z-Man. And that's called Bad Chad, the color. It's a bad dude. Ray asks, in determining watercolor, do you use depth at which you see the lure as a basis to define clarity? Yes. Generally, and it depends on the conditions too. If it is calm and sunny, clear water could be only a couple feet of visibility, because there's not that water disturbance on the surface caused by the wind to break up the visibility underneath. So having calm conditions actually essentially makes baits more visible even in dirtier water. I'm going to run into a tangent here because I'm exhausted. I just drove 4 hours after fishing a tournament. But let me see where we're at. So the answer is yes, I do use the depth at which I can see the bait. But generally, anything over 2 foot of water to me is clear. Then you get into ultra clear, which is like 5 foot of visibility or more. And then you have to fold the conditions like the wind and the sun, the amount of clouds. Those all kind of fold onto themselves and create a whole new layer of variables that dictate your color choices. But we're going to get into those. So you can essentially take these slides and kind of use one principle from one slide, and then once you see cloudy weather, you can kind of mix these together, mix and match, to be able to choose to make the right selections. That's what I do. So let's move on to weather considerations. So as we were kind of talking about, the sun, clouds, and wind really have an effect on the visibility of your bait and how effective that bait's going to be at triggering a strike. Okay, so In clear water, we know if it's bright, sunny, clear water, that's really tough conditions in most situations, because the fish have the advantage of being able to see every little detail on your bait. Okay, that's why we try to camouflage it. So sunny weather, even if you're talking ultra clear or just moderately clear or dirtier water, it creates a more difficult situation. We've all seen it. Post-frontal conditions where it's calm, sunny, some of the toughest fishing conditions, and it's because partly because those fish can really determine a bad presentation from a real bait fish. So sunnier weather calls for more camouflage, just like clear water does. Okay, so if you have sunny weather and clear water, you really want to camouflage your bait, make it really, really flashy. You know, something with some chromes or silvers or something like that. And so you really want to blend into your environment in sunny conditions. But in cloudy weather, like we had today, so for instance, this is a good example on South Holston. Even though it was super clear water, I was able to get away with baits that had a lot of chartreuse in it, that were a little bit more bold, they had a little bit more white, because it was cloudier weather. Okay, so the clouds and also a little bit of wind broke up that visibility. The fish couldn't see the baits as good, and I needed a little bit more color and bold presentation to be able to get strikes from those fish. More opaque colors like white, bone for topwaters. I don't use bone for any other baits. Chartreuse, and also darker colors for bottom bouncing baits that stick out in those darker conditions. And then in windy conditions, they call for a mixture of both sunny and cloudy approaches. So for an example, or another layer to this, if you have partly sunny and cloudy conditions, that's a really good situation to be able to use more chrome and shiny baits, because I'm telling you, when the sun pops out of clouds and you've got a chrome bait, those bass go crazy. Have you ever noticed, and I know that you guys can't respond in real time here, but you've probably noticed on the lake that if you get out there and it's cloudy in the morning, you're not seeing a whole lot of schooling activity. Where are all these fish I've been seeing schooling? And then all of a sudden the sun pops out. Okay, essentially what's happening is the sun is popping out, and all those bait fish that the fish, you know, are falling around out there start shining. They start glimmering, and the fish go crazy. And that's one of the reasons why, if I've got partly cloudy conditions, I'm usually, even in dirtier water, I'm reaching for some kind of chrome or gold bait, because as soon as that sun pops out, the fish really go into a feeding mode once they start seeing that flash. Now, in super muddy conditions, I don't generally use any chrome at all. I usually use real bold, solid colors. Let's see if we got any more questions. Let's clear up some of these. All right, so let's move on to the different lure presentations. So let's talk about jigs. So jigs, as far as bottom bouncing jigs, you know, whether you're casting a jig or using a football jig, you're dragging it, you know, on ledges or whatever. Bottom bouncing. I'm not talking about just flipping and pitching. Flipping and pitching, of course, is part of this, but flipping and pitching kind of imitates a slightly different thing than dragging a jig on the bottom. Jigs in general, as far as bottom bouncing jigs, they are imitating two different things. They're imitating a crawfish, that's the standby, and then they're also imitating bluegill. Even though they look more like the appendages on a crawfish, when a jig is falling, the way it folds, the skirt folds and creates that wide body presentation, it looks very similar to a bluegill. That's why you see the jig bite really good when you're flipping, because those fish generally are feeding on bluegill, and the jig does a really good job at imitating that. So with that in mind, that's what we're trying to imitate. So that's what you're trying to kind of emulate on the water and match the hatch with. So the first consideration is the color of the crawfish that the bass feed on in the fishery. Okay, so that's the first thing. If you're using a bottom bouncing technique, I'm generally looking for what is the color of the crawfish down there. Now, oh, go back. And so there's a lot of different ways to determine this. So you can turn over rocks at the ramp and find a crawfish and you know, figure out the color that way, or just like all the other presentations or all the other things that we've been talking about, the ways to match the hatch, you can look at the bottom color. Okay, crawfish in general. Now there's some extreme variables that you know, there's some extreme examples of crawfish having, you know, bright orange or bright red coloration or blue coloration. Now that's something that happens all the time. But in general, if you want to match the hatch without actually knowing what the crawfish look like, you can actually just match the color of the bottom. Yeah, let's see what I wrote down here. So for instance, somebody already mentioned clay banks. Browns and oranges for clay banks, because you got that kind of orangish clay, reddish orange clay. So anytime I'm in Georgia fishing, you know, say Clarksville or something like that, or any place that has those clay banks, I like to really start using browns and oranges, because I believe that the crawfish generally have that basic color palette. They may have some extreme, you know, the tips of the claws may be red or you know, some variation, but in general I can get really close by using browns and oranges. And then another good example is Dale Hollow the other day. A lot of rocks. Okay, so I was fishing primarily shale, chunk rock, and in that situation, I was using browns, and I was using a brown jig that had a little bit of gray in it too. Had some gray strands in it, and that matched the rock just perfect. So I did very well in that tournament by matching the color of my jig to the rocks. And then anytime you're fishing around grass or even just a little bit of algae that's growing on the rocks, that's when I start reaching for the greens and the browns. You know, green pumpkin is a great example for that. Anytime you're on the TVA, also using something that's green pumpkin or has a little bit of Okeechobee craw, that's a really good color. Keep on doing that. Let's go back. We've got some. All right, so we do have some questions on the chat. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, make sure that you use the Q&A. But I will answer some questions on here. So Marvin asks, when the water is like Coca-Cola, what do I use? It's a good question, but we did also talk about that with the tannic stain. So when I think about Coca-Cola colored water, I think about tannic stained black Florida water, which you also find in other states as well. It's not just a Florida thing. It's in a lot of different places, natural lakes in specific. But anytime you're presented with that, I like to use, if I'm using reaction baits, golds. If I'm using anything that's on the bottom, then it's like June bug, red bug, black and blue, those type of colors. Stay with something dark. All right. So let's talk about flipping. So if you're primarily flipping, pitching, or casting around cover as far as a jig, try matching the color of a sunfish species. Now that's pretty generally easy. You use something that's maybe a root beer. You can see some of the colors down here. These are secret lure jig skirt colors. You can use anything from a root beer, Indie craw, to the candy craw. Those are all really good presentations for imitating bluegill. And the great thing about a jig is that you can use a different colored trailer to match the hatch even better. And one thing that the reason that and somebody already asked about dyes and pens, one of the things that is very important that I've learned in I learned very early on is, at first when I saw people starting to dye their trailers or even just their flipping baits with a little bit of chartreuse, I didn't know exactly what they were doing, but it didn't take me long to realize that sunfish, many species of sunfish on many lakes, have very, very pronounced chartreuse tails. And so a lot of times when I'm trying to imitate a bluegill or a sunfish, that's when I'm going to dye the tail of my bait, or the trailer, the very tip of the trailer, chartreuse, to imitate those bluegill. And then as far as jigs go, in dirty water, stick with black and blue in variations like that. You can use Okeechobee craw. You can use like we see in the bottom left, black neon and chartreuse, but generally black and blue. If I was to pick 3 different jig colors, it would be something like root beer, probably the hot cinnamon and purple, and then black and blue. Okay, so something like a green pumpkin, which is like the root beer, a brownish color, and then black and blue. Those pretty much cover all the different situations. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Q&A. I have to keep on doing that. So Rick asks, so it seems that you were saying that the clearer the water, the more important the color is to matching the hatch. Absolutely. In clear water, it's all about camouflaging. Okay, so the clearer the water, you don't want to be, except for the thing about talking about colors, there's always situations that kind of are outside the box. For instance, in the spring here in Tennessee, there's something called a floating worm, bubble gum, or methylate floating worm. It looks like nothing in nature. It doesn't match the water at all, but it works, and the bass go crazy for it. So there's differences, but in general, yes, in clear water, you want to match the watercolor or the bottom of the lake, the color of the bottom of the lake. As you can see here, for instance, bottom left-hand picture, you've got this clear lake, and it's kind of got this kind of greenish brown silty bottom on it, a little bit of vegetation. That's a perfect place to use green pumpkin, because that'll blend in to the bottom just like a crawfish would, or anything that's walking across the bottom. It's going to want to blend in with its surrounding environment. In clear water, the fish is not going to have a problem finding those baits, but it allows the bait to look more like the predominant forage, and therefore fool the bass that we're trying to do. Jonathan asks, this is a good question about the jig color for the trailers. About the trailer, do you usually use the same color, or do you vary the color? Now, before, I thought the best looking jig, I mean, just an absolute sexy jig, was a jig that the trailer was matched perfectly to the skirt itself. Now, that's kind of changed for me nowadays. The beautiful thing about a jig nowadays for me is the fact that I understand that I can actually fine tune my color selection way more, because you have the skirt material that has its own color, and then you've got a huge selection of different trailers to use as far as those colors. So in situations where I'm trying to find the, if you've got a crawfish that has a certain colored tail versus once you start going up towards the pinchers, they have a different color there. Then you can totally make that exact match by using two different colors. So I do change the colors up quite a bit. On the Tennessee River, for instance, and I don't know if the crawfish are actually this color, but I use a lot of green pumpkin jigs with black and blue trailers, and vice versa. I actually use more black and blue jigs with a green pumpkin trailer. For whatever reason, it looks crazy, but it really, really works. It's a great color combination. So you can mix and match, and I absolutely do that based on the conditions. But on the TVA, that's a really good color combination that a lot of people do a lot of damage with. We're looking at more questions. So some of these I'm going to go ahead and wait to answer. Let me answer another question. What percentage of the time do you use trailers on spinnerbaits, jigs, and chatterbaits? Spinnerbaits, maybe 5% of the time. Jigs 100% of the time, chatterbaits 100% of the time. Always using a trailer on jigs and chatterbaits. I just feel like the profile is better. On spinnerbaits, a lot of times I don't want that extra bulk because it may not ride correctly, it may not track straight, and so I don't use a whole lot of trailers on spinnerbaits. But a lot of people have a lot of success with it. It's just not something I do. So moving on, and again, we're going to answer some more questions. The last thing I want to mention about, we haven't even talked about soft plastics yet. So soft plastics, bottom bouncing techniques, same principle as jigs and everything else. In clear water, you want to use colors that match the surrounding cover or bottom color. Okay, we already talked about this bottom left-hand corner. We've got this silty bottom that's kind of greenish, it's kind of brownish. The great presentation, great situation for a green pumpkin. Green pumpkin it would be great in that situation. Conversely, and we've got that green pumpkin worm there as an example, but on the other side, you've got this clay bank. Okay, you've got this clay bank. This is probably down in Georgia somewhere. Looks like Lake Lanier. And so since we're using a bottom bouncing technique, we want to match the color of the bait to the bottom, not necessarily the color of the water, but the color of the bottom. And so what I'm going to be using is something more of a pumpkin color, or a brownish color, something that is kind of a mix between that brown and that orange clay. And pumpkin's the perfect example for that. But when you get into darker water, dirtier water, that's when you just want to stick with something that really stands out, that has that real good silhouette and profile. Use black and blue, June bug, red bug, or similar darker colors, just depending on the watercolor. When I'm using red bug, usually it's red bug and June bug. That's when I'm fishing primarily, that tannic, coffee stained water. When I'm using black and blue is just a good all-around dirty watercolor. And then on that note too, if you're gonna pick one color for soft plastics, bottom bouncing soft plastics, one color, green pumpkin, is hard to beat, period. It is one of the best colors for versatility. You can use it in clear water, you can use it in dirty water. It matches very well to clay banks, and also, you know, bottoms that have, you know, a lot of vegetation or silt, things like that. Let's see what else, what other questions we got. All right, Mike has a question. Does the time of day make a difference in color choices? So I'm gonna use this for the soft plastics. So, well, we can actually use this for all of the different color choices out there. So we've already talked about the sun and how that affects our color selection. So yes. Typically, you know, today was an example of a day where it was pretty much the same exact level of light all day long. It was overcast, rainy, it even started snowing. So it was pretty much the same brightness all day long. But when it's just a clear sky in the morning, you want to use something a little bit more dark, something that maybe if you're using like a lipless crankbait or crankbait, maybe it's more white or opaque colors. But as soon as that sun pops out, that's when you want to start changing and transitioning into those more camouflage colors, or those shiny chromes and golds that are really going to reflect off that sunlight and trigger those strikes. Ernest asked, and this is for the jigs and soft plastics, it'll work for this too, do you dip the pincher in order to make to match the hatch? Absolutely. Like I was saying about the bluegill, if I'm fishing for bass that are eating bluegill, especially when I'm this is kind of counterintuitive, but if I'm fishing lakes that kind of have moderate stain to it, you know, they're fairly clear, but they've got a little bit of stain to it. Those tend to be the fisheries where those sunfish have the most pronounced chartreuse tails. Now, that doesn't mean that I generally dip my trailers in clear water situations. What I like to do is, so if I'm faced with a clear water situation where I know that the sunfish have those chartreuse tails, that's when I'm going to use a pen versus the dip. So the pens have a very subtle color. When you apply it to the soft plastic, it's a lot more subtle. It's not as bright and pronounced. But the dip, when you dip that, it really does shine. So in dirtier water situations, that's when I use a dip. And in clear water, I use that more subtle pen. But I absolutely do dip the pincher in order to match the hatch, and that goes for crawfish too. If the crawfish in that particular body of water that those fish are feeding on, you know, they spit up some crawfish in the live well, that's a great way to find out what the color is. If they've got some orange on their pinchers, that's when I switch to dipping the claws in some orange. Great question. Michael asks, what about sand bottoms and around dune areas? I don't know what dune area, you must live in the desert or something, down at Havasu. I don't really know, but as far as sandy bottoms go, a great color for sandy bottoms is really pumpkin. Pumpkin, not green pumpkin, but pumpkin itself is one of the best colors for fishing sandy bottoms. You know, something that again blends into that sandy coloration is really important, but really pumpkin, it tends to be my choice around sandy areas, unless it's like a really white sand. And then really what I'm going to do is choose the lightest color that I can find and you know, try to mix in some gold flake into that bait. All right, we've got some questions I'm going to answer a little bit later. All right, so we're going to keep on moving. A lot of great questions. So I'm going to answer all of them. I'm going to get to them pretty soon here, so don't worry. And thank you, anybody, which is great. I know I'm a bumbling mess right now. It's been a long day, but I'm having a good time. All right. So reaction soft plastics. So we've talked about bottom bouncing soft plastics, you know, like worms, you know, craws, and you know, whatever you're using on the bottom primarily. You know, the Ned rig is a great example, or drop shot or something like that. Maybe drop shot isn't a good example because you can use that can be considered a reaction bait and bottom bouncing technique. But reaction baits, so essentially anything that's above the bottom, within the water column above the bottom, that's what I'm considering a reaction bait. Swim baits, you know, flukes or jerk baits, anything that spends most of its time in the water column, and it's supposed to match pelagic bait fish like shad, herring, or the like. Okay. Again, in clear water, match the color of your baits to bait fish. And if you don't know what the forage looks like, again, match your color of the lure to the match the lure color or the flake to the color of the water. So here's a good example. So on the left here, you've got this gorgeous smallmouth bass. Just caught a few today. Love that fish. We got a beautiful smallmouth bass in awesome water that looks just like a South Holston other than the contour. It's got that greenish blue to it. And then on the right-hand side, I selected this diesel minnow color from Z-Man, which is called the Green Lantern. And as you can see, before I changed it, as you can see, it's got the traditional counter shading that bait fish have. It's got a little bit darker on the top and white belly, but it's got a lot of green hues, but also has some blue flake in it too. So I'm essentially matching. I'm still utilizing a bait that looks like the counter shading of a bait fish. You know, light belly, darker, you know, more colored top, but I'm matching the flake and also just the top color to the color of the water column. So that's a great example. That's a color right there that I would probably reach for absolutely first thing in a situation like that. And then when you're faced with cloudy days, maybe there's a lot of wind or dirty water, that's what I'm going to be using, especially on those overcast days like I had today. Even though I had clear water, I was still using chartreuse blades on my spinnerbait and a chartreuse skirt. What else we got as far as questions here? Okay, so it took me a second to, so Matt, he asked, this is a really good question about A-rigs. When fishing A-rigs, what color should you consider for targeting bait on your rig for the fish to isolate? So what essentially I think you're asking is, should you use a different color? What color should you use if you have like a dummy bait or something? And correct me if I'm wrong. If you have like dummy baits on the rig, like here in Tennessee, you can only have 3 baits for that have hooks, and then you have 2 dummy baits. Essentially, I don't change it up at all. Like I don't change it. What I'll do is I'll change the size. So sometimes the ones with the hooks, I'll put a bigger bait, a bigger swim bait on there for those, and then the smaller ones will be the ones that are the dummies. But I generally don't change the color. And while I'm saying that, I actually think that you were asking something different. But no, that was correct. Good. I'm glad I answered it. But yeah, I use the same color and just hope that they hit the actual hook instead of the dummy. I know that that's kind of a haphazard way to go about things, but I think it's more important to get that bite and get more bites than try to hope and pray that changing the colors is going to help you connect with some fish. If that makes any sense. Boy, I can't wait to watch this recording and just see me stumbling with my words. Hope you guys understand after a long tournament day. All right, let's keep on rolling. So skirted reaction baits. Again, same thing with jigs. The skirts on a reaction bait like the chatterbait, we've got 2 chatterbaits here. The beautiful thing about a skirted bait is the fact that you can not only get great color selection with the skirts themselves, but the trailers that you put on there, you can even fine-tune more the presentation. So with skirted reaction baits, as far as just the skirted baits themselves, the trailers it's the same deal. But in clear water, you're going to use more transparent skirt material. Like right here, you got. I think this one is also called Bad Shad. Is that Bad Shad? Yeah. I think that one is called Bad Shad. It's got very translucent, transparent skirt material. The coloration, it has good counter shading, but that's a really good clear water presentation there because it's got that transparent, it's got that flashy chrome blade, and it's got some clear skirt material there. And I matched that with, the Bad Shad trailer is a really good example. So transparent, natural looking skirts when imitating shad, herring, or other schooling bait fish. Now, when you're talking about cloudier days and dingier water, use white, solid whites and chartreuse. Those are great choices for cloudier days like we had today, and dirtier water situations. And you can mix and match. I mean, if you have dirty water, but it's a calm, sunny day, maybe you want to use a little bit more natural looking presentation. And a lot of times I do that and it works really well. But if it's cloudy, maybe it's a little bit windy and you got that dirtier water, stick with that bold color, the white, the chartreuse. All right, let's see where we're at with questions. I think we're all good. Whoa. I was just looking at chat. I had to look at the chat and see what's going on there. Mario, congrats on winning the Brandon Polinick Bassmaster sweepstakes. That's huge, man. You got a new boat and you get to fish with Brandon. That's epic. You win a lot of stuff. You've won one of the prize packages that I had. That's awesome. You're lucky. Yeah, I'll go fishing with you, man. Let's go fishing. You sound really lucky, so let's do it. All right, so let's move into crankbaits. So crankbaits, I get really color specific with crankbaits. Today, we've talked about the spinner baits. I use spinner baits today quite a bit, but really the workhorse of the day was a crankbait. I was using a crawfish. A crankbait. It was a clear crankbait, transparent crawfish color, so it looked real natural in that clear water. But the thing about crankbaits, crankbait fishing, it really is dependent on seasons as well as the regular, weather conditions and the water clarity. For instance, the crankbaits really break the mold, because in the summer and the fall, you're going to be trying to imitate the shad that the fish are feeding on primarily. So white chartreuses and natural shad colors are going to be very popular. But during the spring and the winter, I don't care how clear the water is, you're going to be switching to something like a red, a brown, orange, or a chartreuse, because that's the fish are feeding more on crayfish that time of year. And the crayfish, especially here in the southern region, are those bright colors, those oranges, those reds. You know, spring craw like we've got on the right hand side over here, that's kind of got that brown, orange, and red belly on it. Great example of that. So spring and winter, you're still going to have days where you're going to be throwing shad colored crankbaits, and that's just dependent on the area you're fishing. If you're fishing in an area, even if you're using a crawfish crankbait, and you all of a sudden, you know, start seeing a lot of shad breaking on the surface, or you notice fish are actually you know, eating the shad or spitting up shad when you're catching them, that's when you want to switch to a shad colored crankbait, even if it's during the spring. So you just got to be paying attention. But the go-to colors for springtime, especially in this region of the country, and it's different in every area of the country, is, you know, those oranges and reds. So moving out of that and kind of paying more attention to shad imitations, or, you know, imitating bait fish. When I'm imitating shad or other schooling bait fish, I use the same principles that we've used before. In the cloudier weather, you want to use more opaque colors, cloudier weather, and also dirtier water. So cloudier weather, dirtier water, use opaque colors. Like down here, we've got this citrus shad on the bottom left-hand corner. Citrus shad is a great color, especially during the summer when those fish are feeding on shad out on the main lake structure. In dirtier water, if you got some, I'm not talking about muddy, I'm just talking, you know, a stained water. It's got maybe a little bit of green tint to it, greenish brown tint. This real bold citrus shad is a really good color. But if the sun pops out, it's real sunny, maybe it's just a little breezy, or maybe it's a little bit clear, that's when I start to utilize my golds and chromes a little bit more, to create a little bit more flash. I think when crankbait fishing, outside of when you're trying to imitate crawfish, flash is one of the best tools that you have to entice a strike in sunnier or calmer conditions. Clear water, sunny conditions, calm conditions, chrome and gold are hard to beat. They really do create a reaction strike from fish. There's just something about the flash of a bait fish that makes a bass go crazy. And you know, if you're in clear water, that's when I start to use more chrome. But as soon as you get into the stained water, gold tends to reflect a little bit better in those situations. So that's when I use gold. Is the dirtier water or the tannic stained water, gold is really, really good in those situations. Let's check the Q&A here. I think we're good on that right now. All right, let's talk about topwater. So topwater is kind of funny to me, because there's just as many colors of topwater baits as there are, you know, other crankbaits, you know, that are beneath the surface. And to me, it's kind of it's unnecessary, because really there's 3 different colors that you need. There's white, 4 different colors. So you got clear for the clearest of waters. You got white for just imitating, you know, any type of schooling bait fish on the surface, maybe cloudy conditions or in dirtier water. Black for really dark tannic stained water or situations. Maybe you're fishing around, you know, birds, nesting birds. I know that's a kind of a Western thing. But black is really good for those situations, or anytime you're fishing around grass. grass is a really good place to start using black because the bait fish are predominantly darker in color. And then you want something that has a little bit more yellow and orange to it that kind of imitates a bluegill for fishing shallow. You know, anytime you've got a bluegill spawn or you're just fishing for fish that are feeding on bluegill, yellows and oranges are hard to beat. But you don't have to worry about, one of the things that I don't get is why are the it drives me crazy when I find a bait that has the perfect color on top, but then they ruin it on the bottom. Okay, so really all the fish are seeing is the bottom of the bait. Okay, there's some variation if a bait's kind of rolling, like a walking bait kind of rolls, they'll see the tint on the top too. So why not make sure that you have the right colored top? But really the effective part of that bait is the bottom of that bait. So make sure that you're matching the bottom of the bait to the situation at hand. But generally those 4 colors, clear, white, or bone, black, and some type of bluegill imitation, those are the key colors. So got a good question here. Dave asks, are you going to talk about frogs or horny toad colors? No, but I am now. And that's a really good question. So let's start with frogs, because frogs and horny toads are 2 totally different things. The frogs, I consider hollow body frogs a frog. Okay, so hollow body frogs with the you know the double hook, that's the standard frog. Now horny toads are a category I consider soft plastic buzz baits. Okay, they're the same thing as a buzz bait, but in soft plastic form. That's essentially what they are. They're not frogs, and they're not trying to imitate a frog or a toad at all. They're essentially buzz baits. They're just made to make that gurgling, splashing, and movement. So as far as frogs go, I tend to not just buy a frog to imitate a frog. A frog is a great tool for being able to fish some areas that other topwaters can't, because it's extremely weedless. It skips really well, so you can skip it underneath docks, overhanging limbs, and things like that. So I'm not just using a frog and using a frog coloration. Okay, I never actually am using a frog to imitate a frog. Hardly ever. I can't remember the last time I did that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to still use the same principles, the same 4 color combinations that I have for all the other topwater baits, and I'm going to apply that to fishing a frog. So if I'm fishing a situation where it's clear water and there's predominantly shad, a frog is still a great bait to catch fish on. When you're talking about skipping it underneath things and getting to hard to reach places that other baits will snag. So I'll use a frog that has maybe a little bit more sparkle and clear bottom. I'm trying to imitate shad in a clear water situation. And then a white is just a really good one. Just a plain white frog is a really good presentation in dirtier water or cloudier skies situations. And then black is a great color for fishing around, again, fishing around grass, skipping underneath docks. It's great for fishing around, you know, under overhanging limbs and in darker water in general. Black is a really good color. Now, every once in a while, I do throw in like a brown or a green pumpkin. That one's a really good one for fishing around grass as well, and dark stained water. And then finally, as far as the last frog color, and this is probably the most important one actually. So a lot of times when I reach for a frog, it's when bass are feeding on bluegill, or at least I'm hearing a lot of bluegill sip the surface. And when I hear that, that's when I switch to a bluegill imitating frog, you know, something that has a little bit more yellow or orange on the bottom of it. I don't go overboard. I just want a little hint of, say, orange, and just a very light yellow, and that's what I'm going to be using to imitate the bluegills. Now, as far as toads go, toads are a little bit different. I want to get a reaction bite out of those fish. So generally, I am still going to use a lot of whites, but I like to use the solid blacks as well. And then I also use some more subtle colors, like, you know, something like a pearl belly with maybe a green, watermelon red top to it. The toads are going to be rolling a bit over, you know, none of them really, unless you're using a weighted hook, are going to always stay belly down. So I want to make sure that I'm using a bait that has good coloration on both sides, not just the bottom. But I guess you can say that I use those 4 color variations for all the different topwater baits, including frogs and toads. Because remember, with all these baits, they're not really, in most cases, supposed to imitate, for instance, a frog. It's not really imitating a frog. It's imitating whatever the predominant bait fish is there, that you know, like a bluegill. That's a perfect situation to throw a frog because it imitates a dying bluegill on the surface very, very well. Yeah, I like that saying, Kevin. Kevin says the top is for fishermen, the bottom for fish. That's a great explanation, a great way to put, you know, the color of a topwater bait. You know, as you can see, the baits that I have here are very simple. You got the clear one that's clear throughout. Really, really good a color for especially walking topwaters in open water, in clear open water. That's a great one. And then you got just solid white. There's nothing that irritates me more than having a great looking frog or a great looking topwater with a overly gaudy bottom coloration. Drives me crazy, but I guess I'm just a little picky. Ernest asks, can you use a frog as a search bait in order to have a spawning bass to identify themselves? Absolutely. With a frog, which a frog is one of the best ways to really, especially in grass lakes, to find spawning fish. On Okeechobee, for instance, when you're fishing around those pencil reeds where they're spawning, throwing a popping frog. A popping frog is actually probably my favorite presentation as far as you know, in the frog realm for spawning fish. And the reason for that is a regular frog, even when you're walking it, it's moving forward a little bit more than a popping frog. Popping frog, you can keep it, you can walk the dog in place and it stays in that strike zone, that little area where that bed is, much longer. So you can cast that popping frog out and just keep popping it, little pops, and it'll stay right above that bed for as long as you want it, really. So absolutely, yeah, great way to find spawning fish. All right, so next slide, keeping it simple. All right, so let's talk about my basics. So over the years, I've really eliminated a lot of different. So let me share with you the ones that I use and cover all situations across the U.S. I can catch fish all over the place with these different colors. So for soft plastics, bottom bouncing soft plastics, green pumpkin, black and blue, June bug, watermelon red. Green pumpkin is the best all-around color as far as soft plastics. As we said before, black and blue is great for cloudy days, dirtier water, and darker water. June bug is a great color for tannic stain water specifically. And also, you know, certain situations like ledge fishing, June bug tends to do really well in that stained offshore situations. And then watermelon red. Watermelon red is a great clear water color, and it's also really good for when you're fishing around vegetation. It matches the vegetation really well. As far as reaction soft plastics, white, smoky shad, albino, those are the primary colors. White is for the darker colors, or the darker colored water, and cloudier and windier conditions when you want something to stand out a little bit more. Smoky shad is for the clearest water, sunny conditions. Albino is kind of a mix between the two. It's not quite white, and it's not quite, you know, a transparent smoky shad coloration. It's a really good all-around color, depending on the brand that you're using, because every brand has different variations in their color. Jigs, as far as bottom bouncing techniques, brown is a really good one, especially during the spring. Peanut butter and jelly is another really good one. Okeechobee craw and green pumpkin. Brown is when I'm fishing primarily rock and clay banks. Peanut butter and jelly is mostly clay banks. Okeechobee craw is great in the TVA anytime I've got a little bit more stain water and I still want to use a you know, football jig. Okeechobee craw is really good. TVA, awesome. Green pumpkin is a great all-around color for a jig. Skirted reaction baits, we've got white chartreuse, green pumpkin, and natural shad. So white is really good, again, for dirtier water, cloudier situations, something where you want a bolder color. White and chartreuse is the same thing, just add a little bit of chartreuse, which is better in those situations where you have stained water, but has a little bit of green tint to it. That's chartreuse is really good. And it's also really good when you're fishing for smallmouth or spots. Spots and smallmouth love chartreuse, or they hate it. I don't know which one, but either way, they eat it up. And then green pumpkin is a great color for when you're fishing around grass. Anytime I'm presented with grass and I'm fishing a chatterbait specifically, I switch to green pumpkin because the natural forage around that grass is going to be a greenish dark color, and so I like to go ahead and use green pumpkin. And then natural shad is for the clearest water situations, just something, you know, natural shad is actual color from Z-Man, but there's also, I'm just essentially saying transparent color skirt combinations. You know, you got it's not bold colors, it's just real subtle, clear strands on the skirt. Crankbaits, sexy shad, chartreuse, black back, sexy shad, chrome and gold and red. Okay, so sexy shad is just a great all-around color. When KVD came out with that color, when he requested that, it was genius. Really good coloration because it really does match shad in a wide range of situations. The sexy shad with the white sides, that's when I use it in dirtier water and in cloudy conditions. And then I'm going to skip over to the chrome and gold sexy shad that you use in sunny conditions and in clear water. That's when I like to use those, as we've discussed before. Chartreuse black back is a great dirty water color combination. It's really good in the spring. It's really good anytime you're presented with dirty water. Just overall a really good color. And then red. Red is the springtime color, especially if you live in the South. If you're living up north or you live down in Florida, not so much. For some reason down in Florida, red isn't that big of a color, but anytime you get above Florida into Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, or any place in the South here, all the way to Texas, red is a really, really important color. Anytime that water is below 60 degrees, okay, predominantly below 55 degrees, red is really big. I'd say the water temperature range is like 48 degrees, like 55 is when I start picking up red the most. And then finally, Topwater, black, white, and clear. Those are the three that I like, but we also did mention a bluegill color, so let me add that to it, some kind of bluegill imitation. All right, so let's talk about some regional colors. Now, there's a lot of different regional colors out there, but for Florida, if you're going down to Florida, you have to have Junebug and watermelon red for your soft plastics, even your reaction soft plastic, like Fluke, a watermelon red jerkbait, awesome, awesome color down there. And then golds, you know, your lipless crankbaits, your chatterbaits, your spinner baits. Gold is a really important color down there. In the Northeast, you know, bass love feeding on yellow perch and goby, so you want to use like a yellow perch type color. And then we've got like a green pumpkin is a really good color up there, but a lot of northern anglers like using green pumpkin with a little bit of gold and purple in it. Matches those gobies. California and other spotted bass fisheries, Morning Dawn and pink. Morning Dawn, this right here, Z-Man actually calls it Morning Wood. It's kind of a funny name, but spots absolutely go crazy for this. So that's one of those kind of off the wall colors. I can't really explain it. They just absolutely go crazy for pink in a lot of different situations. It's not necessarily like a Coosa River spotted bass type of color, but you go down to like Lake Lanier or anywhere in California, and Morning Dawn, those pink, you know, morning wood colors, really good. Add a little bit of chartreuse to the tail, and you're good to go for spotted bass fishing. And in the South, again, we talked about red. Red's also really big in like the West Coast, the Delta and Clear Lake, really big colors. So if you live, red is not as big of a player. So it really just depends on the type of crawfish that live in your fishery. And then this is the final slide. We're getting a little bit late here. So in closing, and I'm gonna do the Q&A after this. In closing, I think that the most important thing that I could convey to you in this whole presentation is that it is always better to have confidence in your color selection skills. So your ability to select a color or a certain bait is much more important than having a confidence color or bait. Don't put your faith in a bait or a certain color. Have faith in your ability to choose a color, because if you have one color that you stick to all the time, it's going to burn you sooner or later. So I think that's the most important thing I could share with you guys. So that's the end of the slides here. For you guys that don't have any questions, you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, thank you so much for being here. I know it was a little bit longer, but I really appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you've seen my other webinars, you know that these are always a lot of fun, and they can be found on the Navionics YouTube page. They're all going to be on there, archived. There's a lot of other ones on there too, so go check that out. And also follow me on my social media pages, Sonar Fishing on Instagram, Miles Sonar Burghoff on Facebook. Go check it out, and then sonarfishing.com. There's the plugs. Let's go to the Q&A. All right, let's start from the top. I'm just going to go through here real quick and delete some of these. Some of these I already answered. Okay, so here's a question from Paul. How far off would you position yourself if the bass are not on the beds yet or back in the coves? I fished the opening of the coves and they still were not present. Took all day to get one bite on a shaky head. So in a situation where the fish are still in a transition period, it's kind of fun to put the puzzle together, but it's also pretty perplexing and frustrating at times. I essentially, my process, I have a 3-step process, okay, during the spring, because during the spring, the fish are moving more than any time of the year. They're changing every single day. It's only matched by the fall. But essentially, there's 3 steps, and there's 3 different areas that I'm going to be focusing on with different presentations. I start out on the main lake, okay, and you can flip-flop this if you like. If it's further along in the process, you can flip-flop it. But generally, I start out on main lake structure, the steepest structure that has the deepest water access outside of these spawning bays and coves. I start there and fish, things that I can control the depth. Alabama rigs, swim baits, jerk baits, anything that I can fish on bluff or steep banks. Maybe it's a steep point or something like that. And then if they're not there, then I start moving my way into these spawning areas and start fishing transition banks, 45-degree banks. Maybe there's chunk rock, lay downs, something like that. I like to use a crankbait, something like a DT6 or a wiggle wart or something like that, work my way in. And then once you get into the backs of these pockets, you can approach it different ways. You can either go in there and start looking for spawning fish, or you can make long casts. I generally like to, if I'm fun fishing, just make long casts to these areas. Kind of try to figure out where these spawning fish are. If there's stumps, it's easy to tell. Fish love to bed right next to stumps, so I'll make long casts to those stumps. But to kind of make the answer simple, I don't think you have to. The clearer the water, the further away you want to be from the fish. The dirtier the water, the closer you can be to the fish. So it really just depends on the conditions that you're presented with. Neil asks, if you have a color that's working, when would you try to fine tune the color, or for that matter, switch colors just to experiment maybe something that isn't logical at all? So what I do when I go to a body of water, I generally try to have a good idea as to what a lake, the colors that are regionally good for that area or that lake. For instance, South Holston is very unique in the fact that even though it's not the color that I would generally use, a green pumpkin 4-inch worm is huge on the greatest thing that ever happened to that lake. They weren't on that bite this weekend, but I hear it's like it's so specific, and when it's on, it's just crazy. So I like to know what the regional preferences are when I'm going into it. Like, for instance, down in Florida, if I didn't know that June bug was a big deal down in Florida, I'd be in trouble. So you have an idea, ask around, ask tackle shops what good colors are. But I always start out with, the colors that I choose through my own process. Okay. I'll generally, if it's a weird color, like it's like black and blue and super clear water, I'll still go to, I'll start with a color that should work based on, the process that I go through for color selection. And then I'll work back from there. If that's not working, or it's working and I want to see if something else is going to work, then I'll switch to that regional color preference. But I generally won't go crazy with a color. If there's no regional color preference that I know of, and they're not eating the bait that I'm matching to the conditions, then I'm generally just going to switch to a different kind of presentation. I'll go from a jig to a crankbait or something like that. So I think that a lot of people put too much faith in color. I don't think it's as big of a deal in most situations. So if they're not eating it and you think you have the right color, you probably do have the right color, just not the right time. And so you try a different presentation first. So Ricky asked, how do you rig a trailer hook on a jig with a crawdad? I don't have use a trailer hook on any jigs. When I use trailer hook, it's pretty much just on spinner baits. I don't use them on chatter baits. So I essentially just use the trailer, and that may be what you were thinking, is the soft plastic trailer that you use on the back of the jig to kind of complete that profile. RJ asks, what color hula poppers do you use when drop shotting in 40 feet of water? I like using a chartreuse top with a nice methylate bottom, and then of course I put chartreuse hooks on it. That's my go-to for 40 feet. RJ, thank you. Matt says he'd like to see me do a spoon webinar. Let's do it. I'm not an expert on spoons though, to be honest with you. I love fishing a spoon, but we might do that one day when I have a little bit more experience with flutter spoons out here. The spoon bite is unreal when it's going on though. Brian Rojas. Hello from Tennessee. Thanks for tuning in from Mexico, man. What's up, Harold? You got the Swanee River breast cancer event. Oh man, I wish I could make it there. Even though I'm not gonna miss those giant jumping sturgeon trying to kill me. Pretty terrifying. Jonathan asks, what color works best for fish on the bed? And that really depends, but you know, if you have a fish that's really aggressive on the bed, use a bright color that you can visibly see, because then you can actually know when to set the hook. You know when that fish has picked it up. So use like white or something really bright. White is a really good choice for bed fishing, as long as you got a fish that's like real aggressive, ready to eat. White is a really good choice. Other than that, I use the same. If I've got a fish that's really finicky, I'll use the same principles. I'll just try to blend it in and try to make it look like a bluegill more specifically, or a crawfish. Bluegill are a real nuisance to bass on the bed, so I like to imitate them. Neil, thank you. Harold, I know they're not bad yet, but when I get out there, they're going to be jumping. All right, let's see. I'm going to go on here. All right, we got Jonathan asks, I have a tourney June 9th, Chickamauga, Harrison Bay State Park. Is it cheating if I take a day out with you for a few days before? I don't know. It depends on your tournament. It's certainly not cheating if it's not against the rules. And I'd absolutely love to take you out. Just give me a shout. Read the rules for your tournament, and if if it's well within the rules, you're welcome to come on out, man. Chickamauga is great, and I love June for fishing chick in the areas around here. Jonathan, absolutely, I will. If I've got some spots, you can have them, because I don't fish a whole lot of tournaments out here. I travel around. I fish tournaments everywhere but chick, it seems, except for in the fall. I got a championship here this year. So, all right. let's read some of the chats. It looks like most people are. Man, Mike, thank you for the compliment. I'm really happy. I know I said that I'm kind of tuckered out today, but I really do enjoy sharing this information and talking with you guys. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come out, and it's great because you can just sit there in your sweatpants at home and do this. I've been thinking about. So anybody that would like to book a guide trip or go fishing with me on Chick, just remember you can reach me at Sonar at sonarfishing.com. You can also go to any of my social pages and send me a personal message. I would love to take you fishing. So yeah, we would have a good time. Chick is a great lake. So all right, let's see what we got. Rick, I will, man. All right, it looks like we're wrapping up. If you guys have any other questions, like I said, contact me on social media. Thank you guys very much for showing up tonight. I'm gonna go have a nice cold beverage and get some junk food, eat that, drink that, and watch a movie and go to bed. So thank you guys very much, and I'll be seeing you guys out there on the water and on my social pages. So thank you very much.